Hello. I'd like to thank the Seacoast Jazz Society and the New Hampshire Humanities to Go program for making this presentation possible. My name is Charlie Jennison, and I'm a retired music educator and performer with 45 years' experience teaching at universities and private boarding schools in New England. I still play saxophone and piano in several groups, including the New Hampshire Jazz Orchestra, the Capitol Center Jazz Orchestra, the Seacoast Big Band, and the Freese Brothers Jazz Combo. The focus on the two original presentations, sponsored by the Seacoast Jazz Society, highlighted the musicians and venues that were integral in the formation of the jazz culture that presently exists in the Seacoast. And links to those two lectures can be found on my website, charliejennison.com. As I was preparing the third lecture, I realized I had far too much information for one presentation. So I've posted the second half of tonight's slides and narrative on YouTube for later perusal. The links to both this presentation and that show will be printed in the comments. Please feel free to share with other interested parties. This talk is the third in a series of photographic reflections on the evolution of jazz in the Seacoast area of New Hampshire, and will take us beyond the introductory series to the wider effects that jazz activity in the Seacoast is having on both the regional and national music scene. In this series, I'll describe how the development of a jazz education program and traditional jazz concert series at the University of New Hampshire interacted with and nurtured the cultural transformation of Portsmouth when it was undergoing an artistic renaissance in the 1970s. Why does New Hampshire, with the smallest ocean frontage in the country, have a Seacoast Big Band? Why is Portsmouth, with a population of around 24,000, called the Jazz Mecca of New England? Where do all the musicians and fans come from? The simple answer is that since the heyday of the big bands in the 1930s and 40s, jazz has never really left the Seacoast. Back then, the Hampton Beach Casino featured the all-white sweet bands such as Guy Lombardo and the Dorsey Brothers. A short distance south at Salisbury Beach in Massachusetts, the liquor laws and general attitudes were looser. More aggressive black and integrated bands filled the Frolics ballroom with dancers. Louis Armstrong, Errol Garner, Ella Fitzgerald, and a host of other jazz musicians played inspirational sets. With the advent of the 1950s, however, the economics of supporting a big band had become overwhelming. Pop singers and rock and roll captured the public's fancy as the big bands quietly disintegrated into their individual components. Small combos played more intimate jazz in clubs and lounges as the giant ballrooms joined other relics of the past. Many music educators in the 1950s and 60s had been veterans of traveling big bands in the swing era, and the nascent profession of jazz education was just starting to develop in high schools and universities around the country and here in New England. In time, many of these same musicians settled near their old stomping grounds, getting day jobs and occasionally playing at night. For several reasons, Portsmouth provided an attractive haven for some of the musicians who left the touring band. First, there's the city's inherent beauty with its weathered brick buildings and winding historical districts. The location is ideal, a few minutes from the beach resorts, yet only an hour from both Boston and Portland. In the late 1960s and 1970s, the landscape of Portsmouth moved in new directions. A new generation with fresh ideas and entrepreneurial energy cultivated a vision that diverged from earlier approaches to the community's growth and embraced both historic preservation and modern development. Business owners, civil servants, and cultural leaders leveraged the accessibility of the Seacoast offered by I-95, the inheritance of historical architecture, and the availability of federal funds to create an environment that attracted restaurateurs, fine and performing arts, and turned Portsmouth into the destination it is today. If there was a bird's eye view of Portsmouth's sea change in the 1970s, it was from Grace Casey's peacock chair at the River House on Bow Street. The work of the photographer she chose to document the decade was featured in a free exhibit that opened August 4, 1983 at the Portsmouth Athenaeum. Peace, Love, and Portsmouth, celebrating the city's cultural renaissance through the lens of J.D. Lincoln. Casey met Lincoln in the late 1960s. An antiques dealer, she had recently revived the New Hampshire Art Association. She's also credited with conceiving the idea of the first Prescott Park Arts Festival in 1974, an event which has morphed into a summer-long art series culminating in an annual jazz festival. According to a bio in the Athenaeum archives, Lincoln grew up in Wentworth, New Hampshire, and took up photography at 11 years old, serving in his teens as a photographer for several northern New Hampshire resorts. He attended the University of New Hampshire and served in the U.S. Air Force in the Korean War. His decision to make a living as a photographer came in his late 20s. He began taking photographs in the Seacoast in 1970, working as a stringer for the Boston Globe. He also got assignments from Grace Casey. She asked Lincoln to teach photography to young people as part of the Prescott Park Art Festival's art class curriculum. In his 1982 book of photos, People of Portsmouth and Some Who Came to Town, Lincoln reflects on the city's shift from an 18th century watering hole to a happening place for artists, tourists, restaurants, and residents. Lincoln wrote, quote, "In the 1970s, both tourists and the locals patronized the theater. Then came the restaurants, and then came music. The population of musicians multiplied to the extent that by the end of the decade, music permeated Portsmouth daily and nightly, 7 days a week. Lincoln's images depict many signature moments in Portsmouth's history: the city's 350th anniversary parade in 1973, the first Market Square Day in 1978, performances at Theater by the Sea, Jimmy Carter's presidential campaigns, and arts czar Casey's River House. The Lincolns left Portsmouth for Santa Fe in 1984, but returned 18 years later. His wife died in 2020. He passed away last October. The career photographer appeared in several movies, loved jazz, and according to his obituary, enjoyed spirited discussions with his friends and family about food, art, music, and world events. Although he was from the Manchester area, musician and bandleader Ted Herbert employed or influenced many players from the Seacoast, including myself. Born in 1915, he learned to play violin at 8 and picked up the clarinet and saxophone at 14 to play at dances with local bands. In 1935, the Ted Herbert Orchestra was officially formed, playing for high school and college dances and ballrooms throughout the Northeast and New York State. In 1946, after service in the Army, conducting musical shows for the troops, Ted fronted his band at the famous Hampton Beach Casino 6 nights a week for 26 consecutive summers. In 1958, he became the owner of the original Music Mart, which grew to a large retail operation in Manchester with 50 music teachers and close to 1,000 students. Ted also served on the New Hampshire Commission for the Arts for 8 years. He retired in 1990 after 55 years in the band business. No history of jazz in Seacoast, New Hampshire would be complete without including pianist Paul Verrett. Verrett received his bachelor's from UNH in 1952 and his master's from Boston University. After a term of military service, he came back to UNH in 1962 as a part-time instructor, becoming a full faculty member in 1965. Paul performed with big bands and jazz combos throughout the 1950s, including Ted Herbert's band, and was as conversant in the jazz world as he was in academia and the classics. In addition to his teaching duties, Paul was also a practicing professional musician for over 60 years, playing gigs right up to his time of passing in 2007. For more than a decade, he played at the Metro Restaurant in Portsmouth. Verrett was central to bringing the traditional jazz series to UNH, working closely with Dorothy Prescott, its benefactor. And on that subject, I'll go into more detail a bit later. Here, drummer Les Harris Sr. is pictured with Gene Krupa, Benny Goodman's drummer. Born in 1932, Les discovered his love of music through his father, who was a vocalist in the group The Three Blue Aces. As a teen, Les studied drums with the famed educator George Stone, graduating from Newburyport High School in 1950. He attended the Navy School of Music, and after completing his service in the South Pacific, Harris went to the Berklee School of Music in Boston on the GI Bill, studying with Alan Dawson and drumming in the house band at the famed Storyville Jazz Club. Later in 1967, Les began his career at Berkeley teaching arranging, harmony, and ear training, earning the title of full professor. One of his most important roles in Portsmouth was as a member of the Tommy Gallant Trio on the Sunday night press room sessions, which started up around the late 1970s. The Seacoast Jazz Society presented Harris with a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2019. Les Harris Sr. passed away at the age of 90 in 2022. Probably the single most influential musician in the development and growth of Seacoast jazz is the gentleman whose piano playing we were just listening to, Tommy Gallant. His family was originally from Exeter. Tommy was an integral part of many jazz groups, workshops, concerts, and the music education scene in the Seacoast for over 40 years. Sometime in 1967, Paul Verrett introduced me to Tommy, who had been active in the Seacoast area since the late 1950s. He invited me to stop by the Library Restaurant in the Rockingham Hotel in Portsmouth and bring my saxophone, and we struck up a lifelong musical friendship. With drummer Les Harris Sr. and bassist Jim Howe, Tommy established the Sunday night jam session at the Press Room on Daniel Street that attracted musicians from all over the country and helped establish Portsmouth as the creative musical hub of New Hampshire. For over 30 years, Tommy also taught jazz piano and directed bands at Phillips Exeter Academy, featuring many professional jazz players in a concert series held at Phillips Church. Born just a year before me in 1946, Jim Howe is best remembered for his role in the Tommy Gallant Trio, of which he was an original member, and for his presence in that group on Sunday nights at the Press Room as a sideman for some 20 years. When Tommy passed in 1998, Jim carried on as leader of the Jim Howe Trio for another 9 years. Jim grew up in Old Town, Maine, where he began playing the upright bass in the 6th grade. After graduating high school in 1964, he went on to the University of Maine in Orono, playing with the Bangor Symphony. After graduation, Jim moved to Boston, where he met band leader Tony Bruno, who later hired Jim for a steady gig at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods. Jim got married, started teaching junior high school in Manchester, then some years after that made his move to the Seacoast, establishing himself in Portsmouth, not only as a musician, but as a photographer, playing regularly at the Press Room and 2 nights a week at the Metro, where he teamed up with pianists Paul Verrett and Paul Donovan. The Seacoast jazz community was shocked on October 13, 2007, when Jim passed away at the age of 61. At that time, drummer and longtime bandmate of Jim, Les Harris Jr., said, "First and foremost, Jim was a great guy. Everyone who knew him loved him. He was a real loyal friend, a give you the shirt off his back kind of guy." Les Jr.'s father was the original member of the Press Room Trio before relinquishing the drum set to Les Jr. sometime in the early 1990s, when he came off the road from the vocal jazz group called the Ritz. Les has maintained a dual career as a teacher at UNH, University of Southern Maine, Phillips Exeter Academy, and Newburyport Middle School, while playing several nights a week locally or in Boston. His association with UNH led to concerts with many nationally recognized players on the traditional jazz series. And with his vocal talents, he's also been part of several Beatles revival groups and created 2 albums with original lyrics based on the tunes of jazz trumpeter Clark Terry. Here pictured with Tommy Gallant are Jim Howe and Les Harris Jr., the group responsible for supporting the long-standing Sunday night jam at Portsmouth's Press Room. Tommy was committed to helping promote jazz in the local area. In addition to organizing the annual Harry Jones Memorial Scholarship Concert, held each year at the Music Hall in Portsmouth, Gallant could often be found performing and giving clinics on the art of jazz at local schools. He ran jazz workshops at UNH, and his groups played in the traditional jazz series. An early member of the Seacoast Jazz Society, he was a driving force behind the Portsmouth Summer Jazz Festival. And after his death in 1998, it was decided until recently that the festival be named for him in honor of his lifelong service to the community as musician and educator. In the 1960s and 70s, this popular restaurant featured many local musicians and a weekly jam session around the piano bar where Tommy and his trombone-playing friend Phil Wilson held court. It still features jazz guitarist Paul Bourgeois with various groups on Wednesday nights. The original Rosa restaurant opened in 1927. In the 1960s and 70s, the establishment hosted the Memorial Bridge All-Stars, a traditional group with a steadfast following in the Seacoast. In the 1980s, under new ownership, I remember some great sessions held there by a group known as the Turkey Club, which would meet once every few months at Rosa's or the Exeter Inn for the purpose of seeing old friends, having a jam session, and swapping the latest stories. This group included some of the best jazz players in New England and their fans. But with the passage of time, most of the original members of the club are now gone. And after a 2012 renovation, Rosa's has not featured music as part of its atmosphere. The Dolphin Striker was a mainstay on the Portsmouth restaurant scene for almost 5 decades. This venue, now closed, featured an underground bar with a working well and music several nights a week, some of which was jazz-related. One popular group appearing regularly in the 1970s was Ben Baldwin and his Big Note. The press room opened its doors in November '76 by Jay Smith, journalist, quite quiet philanthropist, musician, and folk music lover, to provide a place for local musicians to perform and their fans to gather for, quote, nourishment of the body, mind, and spirit. A few years later, the press room expanded into the second floor of the building in order to accommodate more popular performers and larger audiences. The press room quickly solidified its reputation as one of the most important music venues and gathering spots in the Seacoast. Standing the test of time, decades-old traditions like Hoot Night, Sunday Jazz Series, traditional music open mic, Tuesday Night Jazz Jam, and others remain mainstays of the space for 40 years. One musician who contributed significantly to the success of this venue was Larry Garland, the son of a Baptist minister. Growing up, Larry taught himself the fundamentals by looking over his mother's shoulder at the piano and trusting his good ears. He joined the Army in the 1950s and started hanging out with musicians at the School of Music in Bethesda, Maryland. It was in that context that Larry, still in his 20s, got to play with musicians like Chet Baker, Stan Getz, and Zoot Sims. Pretty heady stuff for a young musician. After that, Larry lived with his family in Lynn, Massachusetts, and played with a lot of the North Shore and Boston area music legends like Herb Pomeroy and Charlie Mariano, players who appreciated Larry's great ear and his natural creativity, and who later played at his sessions. He moved to Portsmouth from Newburyport in 1977 and went to work at the press room, which had opened only the year before. Jay Smith told Larry, "I want folk and jazz here, no rock and roll." On June 10, 1979, the first Market Square Day took place, and subsequently provided many local jazz groups the opportunity to develop a wider audience. Dances took place at the Masonic Hall, the Cape Nettic Lobster Pound, and Yokin's Restaurant. Concerts happened at the Portsmouth High School Auditorium, outdoors on stages, and indoors at the South Church and the newly renovated Music Hall. And the press room began hosting regular Sunday night jams. Moving through the 1980s, the pace of activity picked up considerably in the Seacoast as local musicians and UNH grads began forming various groups and frequenting local clubs, supplemented by other visiting musicians. In 1995, Jay Smith sold the press room to Jay Gardner, who kept the heart of the press room spirit intact, maintaining the venue's commitment to presenting live music 7 days a week. In late 2016, after 21 years at the helm, Gardner decided to sell the business and the building. In June the following year, facing extensive renovations to meet modern code requirements, the press room closed its door for the first time in 40 years, without assurance that it would reopen. Now, however, under new ownership And following a gut renovation of the building, the press room has begun its third incarnation. The new owner, Josh Sheets, is a native of Hampton, New Hampshire, and founder of Trigger House, a Portsmouth-based experiential marketing agency, which specializes in the food and beverage and live entertainment industries. The press room reopened its doors on October 31st, 2018. The Music Hall is an 895-seat theater in the same block as the old Kearsarge Hotel, once also a jazz and blues venue. Built in 1878, it claims to be the oldest operating theater in New Hampshire. An independent venue that offers music, readings, comedy, and cinema, the Music Hall brings in 130,000 visitors a year. In the past, it has hosted musicians like Tony Bennett and authors like Dan Brown. Boasting a long and varied history, the theater was converted after World War II into a movie theater. The Civic remained a favorite venue for the Portsmouth community until it was sold to a holding company in the early 1980s. After a brief period of closure and a trip to the auction block, the Music Hall was again reopened. Thanks to the generosity, hard work, and foresight of a group of concerned residents known as the Friends of the Music Hall, the theater emerged as a non-profit center for the performing arts. Now the only remaining venue of its kind in Portsmouth, the Music Hall operates as it did in 1878, bringing the region world-class entertainment, both live and on film, and providing a meeting place for members of the community. In 1996, I participated in a gala jazz concert at the Music Hall, honoring trumpeter Clark Terry. It featured Marshall Royal on alto sax, Milt Hinton on bass, and Alan Dawson on drums, along with many local players and celebrities, including Tommy Gallant, Jim Howe, and Les Harris. This concert was a result of the collaboration of a Portsmouth-based nonprofit known as the Seacoast Jazz Society and the University of New Hampshire Music Department, and serves as an introduction to the next section of this presentation. I was privileged to teach at UNH from 1982 to 1996. My primary responsibility was to work with the music education majors who were studying saxophone, but I also assisted with the second jazz band and played in the faculty jazz group as well. This meant that I was often involved with hosting visiting jazz artists and clinicians, and as a result got the opportunity to participate in workshops and presentations, and even played on some concerts with artists such as Buddy DeFranco, James Williams, Milt Jackson, Bob Mintzer, and many others. Additionally, I was part of the Durham-Portsmouth Jazz Connection, playing in local clubs, concerts, and festivals, and participating firsthand in the proliferation of jazz in the musical community during the last third of the 20th century and into the new millennium. An individual whose contribution to the Seacoast jazz scene cannot be overstated is multi-instrumentalist and music educator Dave Seiler. After experiencing demand for more jazz instruction due to the formation of a student-faculty stage band in 1969, the faculty of the UNH Music Department felt it was time to hire a full-time jazz band conductor whose duties would also include teaching improvisation and developing a jazz program. In the fall of 1972, David Seiler was hired, and the UNH Jazz Band became an official ensemble of the university. Dave immediately went to work creating an environment where jazz could flourish, both within the school and outside its boundaries. Dave and Paul Verrett also organized a faculty jazz group that performed contemporary jazz tunes for students and local audiences. Here's a snapshot of the first UNH faculty jazz group, with Paul Verrett on piano, John Hunter on bass, Les Harris Jr. on drums, and Dave Seiler and myself on various woodwinds, including saxophone, flute, and clarinet. A native of La Crosse, Wisconsin, Dave received his bachelor's in music education and a master's in clarinet performance from the University of Wisconsin. He taught and conducted at Millikan University, Lamar State College, and the University of Idaho, all before coming to UNH, where, in addition to his duties as Director of Jazz Studies, he was a professor of clarinet. Under the direction of Seiler, the UNH Jazz Band quickly became a proficient ensemble with high-quality performers. The number of musicians in the program grew so much that in 1975 it was necessary to add a second jazz band. Dave hired me in 1982 to teach saxophone and assist with the newly named Bratton Hall Jazz Band, and I directed it until 1986. In 1973, Dave organized the first annual UNH Jazz Festival, which was open to high school jazz bands, combos, and choirs throughout New England. Each year, the festival featured performances by the UNH Jazz Band and special guest artists. At the first UNH Jazz Festival, Dave hired guest artist Roy Haynes on drums and Benny Green on piano, underwritten by Ted Herbert. Clark Terry was invited the next year, in 1974, and for many subsequent years, revisited UNH for concerts and workshops as artist in residence. If you're not familiar with Clark's playing, he's one of the most respected jazz trumpeters of the 20th century and is worth checking out. What really put UNH on the map is when Dave took the UNH Jazz Band on a successful tour to the Montreux Jazz Festival in 1976, with Clark as featured artist. From then until his passing in 2015, Clark maintained a close relationship with UNH and helped further the music education of many students there and around the world. In 1986, UNH gave Terry an honorary doctorate of music. Because of Terry's yearly support and presence at the Jazz Festival, the festival was renamed in honor of Terry and is now known as the Clark Terry Jazz Festival. Other guest artists and judges have included Bob Mintzer, Eddie Daniels, Al Gray, and Frank West from the Count Basie Band. In 1978, Seiler organized a community big band featuring some of the area's best jazz players. He drew from local music educators at the high school and college level and included other players with previous big band experience, often calling on his university students to sub at rehearsals and concerts when needed. The band included an attorney, a judge, a banker, a dentist, and other professionals who played jazz on the side, and were happy to find a suitable outlet for their musical talents. Until the pandemic, the Seacoast Big Band was an anchor at every jazz festival held in Portsmouth, often featuring national artists like Joe Williams, Bob Mintzer, Louis Bellson, and of course, Clark Terry. The UNH Traditional Jazz Series was formed in 1979, ushering in a whole new era of the finest musical talent to be found anywhere visiting the Seacoast. Paul Verrett and Dave Seiler were key in establishing a relationship with Dorothy Prescott that eventually culminated in her underwriting the series. Born December 30th, 1921, Dorothy Ruth Cook was a native of Everett, Massachusetts, graduated from Everett High School in 1939. After tours in D.C. and New York City, Dot moved back to Boston around 1944 and reacquainted herself with the Boston scene, becoming a member of the Boston Jazz Society, through which she met Sam Prescott. Both ardent jazz enthusiasts and supporters, each had significant record collections. Prescott's first love was the traditional jazz music played by artists such as Benny Goodman, Gene Krupa, Harry James, Duke Ellington, and a particular favorite of hers, Bunny Berrigan, known for the hit song, I Can't Get Started With You. In later years, her tastes broadened and she tolerated Dave Brubeck, the Modern Jazz Quartet, and a few other progressive jazz groups and musicians. With the exception of Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald, Prescott didn't care much for jazz vocalists, as she believed they mostly got in the way of the music. She believed that jazz musicians seldom got a fair shake from club owners, and vowed that if she ever presented live music, she'd always treat the musicians with the utmost respect. Her admiration for jazz musicians manifested itself in 1978 when she formed the New Hampshire Traditional Library of Jazz, now known as the NHLTJ. Initially housed in her home in Auburn, the NHLTJ not only had books, records, and Boston area memorabilia, it served as a vehicle for maintaining her connections to friends and musicians. In 1979, Prescott collaborated with Paul Verrett and Dave Seiler to establish the New Hampshire Traditional Jazz Series of live concerts. She funded the series and worked tirelessly towards fulfilling her promise to showcase musicians in the proper setting. In developing the series, she did yeoman's work. She not only helped select the musicians, she produced and distributed the marketing materials, hosted dinners on concert day, took photos, and saw to it that no detail was omitted. It was a labor of love, and Prescott became lifelong friends with many of the visiting musicians. Prescott provided for the continuation of the Jazz Library beyond her lifetime. In 1985, she entered into an agreement with UNH in which the school would perpetuate the library and its activities. Her will generously endowed the project, and since her death in 1988, the New Hampshire Library of Traditional Jazz has continued to vigorously pursue her original objectives. Olive Prescott's correspondence, publicity, recordings, and photos were bequeathed to the university and form the basis of the collection, which also includes memorabilia illuminating the Boston area jazz scene, primarily of the 40s and 50s. It documents the formation and operation of the NHLTJ from 1978 through Prescott's death in 1988. Finally, there are photos, publicity, and ephemera related to the first decade of the traditional jazz series, which began in 1979. Often the musicians featured on this Monday night series would arrange to stop by the press room on the preceding Sunday and play with the house trio. It was because of this and the Clark Terry birthday celebration concerts that university students and Portsmouth jazz fans got to hear players like Dave McKenna, Jimmy Matze, Dave Whitney, Kenny DeVerne, Grace Sargent, Bud Freeman, Bob Wilbur, Gene DeStasio, Harry Allen, Billy Novick, Alan Dawson, Frank West, Milt Hinton, Scott Robinson, Buddy DeFranco, Al Gray, Snooky Young, and many others during the 1980s and 90s. This seems like an appropriate time to mention an individual who contributed significantly to the recording of jazz in the Seacoast. Here's a picture of engineer Gaylord Russell at home in West Epping, New Hampshire with his wife Jane, sometime around 1990. Gaylord and Jane were avid jazz supporters and regulars at the press room. Russ was responsible for archiving many of the early trad jazz concerts at UNH. He also was involved in the production of albums and CDs for many of the artists mentioned in this evening's presentation. His record and tape collection covered 3 walls in his living room and ended up at the UNH library, where it is currently being digitized and archived. In addition to Dave Seiler and the Faculty Jazz Quartet, other faculty members contributing to the growing jazz program at UNH were composition teacher and pianist Michael Anacarico, John Rogers, who developed the electronic and computer music program, and Robert Stibler, trumpet teacher, who, although a classical player himself, helped many UNH trumpet students develop their technique, which they later applied to their jazz playing. One of the most influential graduates of UNH around the late 60s was bandleader and entrepreneur Clayton Skip Poole. He formed the first Clayton Poole Orchestra with some UNH students and local semi-professional musicians that played for events, dances, clubs, and concerts around the state. Over the years, Skip acquired an immense library of classic big band arrangements as he featured various guest artists like Mel Torme, Rosemary Clooney, Johnny Mathis, Andy Williams, Dionne Warwick, and many other major music stars. Skip, as he's known to his family and friends, has enjoyed over 40 years of bringing top quality music to audiences all around the United States.